You are in the room where we will be doing a presentation on bisexuality in marriage and singleness. If that's not what you're here for, you should stay anyway. It's going to be fun. My name is Emily Joy. If you want to tweet during the session, at Emily Joy Poetry. This is SueAnn Shiah, at SueAnn, SueAnn
Congratulations.
You can tweet about our session. How this is going to work is SueAnn's going to talk for like 20 minutes, I'm going to talk for like 20 minutes, and
we're going to interrupt each other a lot.
Yes. And then we'll take 20 minutes of like questions, and we'll have some discussions. Without further ado, yes, but I will give it to you, and then you need it.
If I need to interrupt, I'll
yes, you can just over here.
Okay. Sorry, I'm setting up this.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, cool. We are also catered for really bad bisexuality puns.
Yeah.
By the way, is the title of our session. So if you have any bad bisexuality puns, feel free to shout them out. Do you want to hear while SueAnn is testing this mic? I write poetry. It's one of the things that I do. And I wrote a bisexual haiku, and I told this to my husband, and he was like, "Don't you mean a baiku?" So this is my bisexual haiku. It goes like this. Do I want to be her or make out with her? It's really hard to tell. A bisexual haiku. Okay, here's SueAnn.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. Sorry, I was just very concerned with the technology accessibility things, but thank you all for being here. Just a quick, so we know who's in the room, who here kind of identifies somewhere in the bi plus? Cool, all right. Hey fam, it's good to be in your company. Do we wanna, I know, should we start? People are still coming in.
Yeah,
But
just go.
just start, okay.
You're gonna miss the fun.
They're just gonna miss some of the fun. Well, hopefully they don't have too much FOMO. Emily said I am SueAnn Shiah, and we used to both live in Nashville, Tennessee. I recently moved to Detroit, and I identify mostly, when people ask, I use queer, but I will talk about how I came to more openly identify as bisexual of late. So. This is going to be the general arc. I grew up in a Taiwanese American family in Metro Detroit. My family are not Christians, and around age 13, through an all-girls Christian camp ministry, I became a Christian. From there, I was all in, just totally all in. I wanted to take off the old clothes and put on the new clothes. I wanted to be completely transformed. I wanted to enculturalize myself into Christianity because, that's what you do. You assimilate, you enculturalize. And so I kind of went through a neo-fundamentalist stage.
Same.
Yes, so I kind of explain this to people sometimes as I listen to Focus on the Family every day. I'm 13, I'm yes, tell me more about how to have a godly marriage and how to raise your children. I was tell me, I just want to know everything about Jesus, right? And this is fascinating. I've been teasing this out more lately because I thought it was normal, but it wasn't. I was friends with a lot of very conservative homeschoolers. Mostly because the camp ministry that I'd come to be a Christian through had a lot of homeschoolers. Now, Emily here is a homeschooler. And I'll tell you, when I was 13, I was friends with a bunch of homeschoolers, and now I'm still friends with a bunch of homeschoolers. We just gravitate towards each other because we're nerds. And so my needle to where normal was a little bit further to the right. But I was all in, and I didn't have a lot of help necessarily navigating that world. It's not like my parents knew anything about white evangelicalism. They just knew that they had to drive me to church and Bible study 3 or 4 times a week, right? I learned all about purity culture and learned very quickly what was expected of a woman, a Christian woman, and sex and desire. So So let's put it this way. I started masturbating pretty early, and I didn't really know that it was masturbating. I think that that's actually kind of a common experience for people. You're just like, oh, it's like scratching itch, feels good, cool. And then I was like reading like a 17 magazine or something, and they have those Q&A sections, and some girl had asked a question about masturbating. I was like, what's that word? I'm gonna look it up in the dictionary, because that's what I do when I don't know what words mean. I look them up in the dictionary. And I was like, I think that's what I've been doing. And then I became a Christian, and I was like, oh, lust is bad, and I have to not do this. So I was like, I'm just gonna stop. And I did. It was so easy. I just stopped. It was like, the power of Jesus is so deep. All of that lust just disappeared, okay? And all the lust just disappeared. I had no problem. I was like, great. I just overcome sin. And so at that time, I thought I was straight. It never occurred to me, because like I knew about gay people and stuff, and I was like, well, I like boys, so never came up. And and then I was like coming into this culture which has very defined rules about men and women, and I wanted nothing more than just like be a godly woman and marry a godly man and birth godly babies. And I mean, it's kind of interesting. This is the intersection of me being a second generation Taiwanese American, as well as converting into Christianity. Is I had this like picture in my head of like a beautiful white boy that I would marry, who had like a big family, probably like from a homeschooler, and like he would teach me how to hunt, and we would like do stuff like that, and like family, and like I would like go to his big like American white family for like Christmas and Thanksgiving. And
I was like with you up until the hunting, and then I was like, wow, that got too specific for me.
Obviously, the queerness has always been there. I just wasn't aware of it, and I like carry pocket knives around still. I've always carried pocket knives around. But yeah, so like I had this idea, and I was so like, yes. And it was interesting. I read books like Passion and Purity. I read God Writes Your Love Story, Authentic Beauty. I was really heavy on the Ludies, and because my friends really liked them. And I actually remember, after reading Passion and Purity, I was like, oh, like, becoming a Christian means I might be single for the rest of my life. So I need to ask myself a question. If God asked you to be single, would you still stay a Christian? And I was like, I gotta think about that. I just want to be sure, right? I'm like, what is this cow that I'm buying, right? I'm like, okay. All right, I'm still in. And it was fascinating because the whole culture was all like girls pointing us to boys, godly marriage, all that. And I was like, but God might ask you to be single. And so from there, I just kept going. I mellowed out a bit, I joined a Reformed community, and that was supposed to be a joke, but it actually did kind of mellow me out. I got involved with RUF in college and joined a PCA church. And for those who don't know what RUF is, it's Reformed University Fellowship. And it was during that time that I had like a queer awakening. I also had a racial awakening. I went to Belmont University, which is a historically Baptist school in Nashville, Tennessee. So I was like removed from my Taiwanese community, and I was like surrounded by white people all the time. And I was like, oh, I grew up in the suburbs. I thought I was like good on white people. But this is a lot of white people. I just want a bowl of noodles. Like, just give me a bowl of noodles, please. Like, and like also when I eat that bowl of noodles, I have people give me like weird looks too. And so it was just like everything was just turned up to like 14. And I started to realize that I was attracted to women, which I don't know. Are we on time? Because I like can tell too many stories, and I don't.
You got 10 more minutes.
All right. Yeah. So I love this story. My friends know it because I love telling it. You know how when I Kissed a Girl came out by Katy Perry, that the Dobsons of the world were like, no. this is going to lure our children into a homosexual lifestyle. And you're like, a song is not that powerful, right? Like, you need to chill. This is just fear-mongering. Well, so I was so conservative when I was in high school. That was when the song came out. I was in high school that I didn't listen to the radio, right? I only listened to Christian radio, and I listened to like really obscure indie music. So I didn't listen to any pop songs, and I remember everyone talking about the song I Kissed a Girl, but I actually had never heard it. So it wasn't until my freshman year of college that I got really into Katy Perry, which, ding, girl, come on, keep up. I heard the song, and I was just like, I kissed a girl, and I liked it. And I was like, if I kissed a girl, would I like it? This is a very scary question to ask. You're very committed to being heterosexual stuff, and I was like, I think I would. and so I just was like, I was binge watching The L Word in secret on my dorm and like angling my laptop away from my roommate so she couldn't see what I was watching. And it was just, I was processing all of it, and
which ironically is like so biphobic, that show, but it's like all you have.
Yes, it's all you have. And it was like, wow, there's just a lot of sex happening, and I'm very uncomfortable, but I can't tell if I'm like turned on uncomfortable or if I'm just like, this is bad, uncomfortable. And I didn't know what to do. And I had the classic kind of like, well, can you be gay and be Christian? And am I gay? I mean, I've had crushes on boys. Obviously, I used to have a masturbation problem where I fantasized about men. I don't know. Like, thankfully for me, I was able to sort out a lot of stuff. In all those years, I never once thought that I was going to hell because I was, attracted to women. I never thought God didn't love me. I never once prayed that God would change my sexuality. And I think for me, that's actually kind of a unique part of my story as a bisexual person, is that I was like, well, I don't need to try and produce attraction to men to counter my attraction to women. They're all just kind of there. So anyway, I had a lot of bierasure when I started to come out to people in my community. And I felt very compelled to do that, even though it was like, I still might marry a man. I felt like there was first, I was like, scripture says, like, you must carry one another's burdens, you must tell the truth, you must confess. So I was like, well, SueAnn, you haven't acted on any of your same-sex attractions, but you know what you're doing? You're lying by not coming out, and that's actually a sin. So it is your moral responsibility to come out. And that's the only way I was able to like kind of psych myself through that. And I think a lot of bisexual people stay in the closet, but for me, I'm just like a super moral person, and like to a bad perspective, like I can really browbeat myself over it, right? I'm like, no, you have to do what's right.
Somebody tweet that. I'm such a super moral person.
I feel things very deeply. I'm very convicted about things. And I used a lot of the language of same-sex attraction in the beginning just because I was like, well, I'm attracted to men and I'm attracted to women. I really I refused. Like in the first year, I refused to use the term gay, lesbian, or bisexual to identify myself because I was like, well, I just don't identify with those terms. But I also knew subconsciously that I used any of those words that my Christian friends would immediately think of like whatever the mass media assumption of bisexual, gay, or lesbian was, and that was a person that wasn't a Christian. And I didn't want, when I was coming out, for them to think I was telling them I'm no longer a Christian. So I used same-sex attraction a lot, and I was encouraged to read a lot of stories from people who had ex-gay narratives, even though they don't necessarily advocate for conversion therapy. So like Rosaria Butterfield's book, as well as Christopher Yuan, he came and he spoke at the Chinese church that I worked at. And it was kind of fascinating because Rosaria is also Reformed. She's Presbyterian as well. And I felt like my story was reversed from hers. So for those who don't know, she was a lesbian professor at like Syracuse or something, women's studies, whatever. And then she, while researching purity culture to like shred it, she started becoming friends with this local pastor. And then through this relationship with his family, she became a Christian, and then she left her lesbian partner and eventually married a man and is like a homeschool mom now. You see, like my story's like in reverse, right? Like I really wanted to marry a pastor and like be a homeschool mom and like all these sorts of things. And I was like, oh, so gung-ho for God. And then it was like many years into my journey that I was like, oh, like what? I've been so faithful. Like, why is this happening to me? Like, what's wrong? Like, and you know, in my theology, like I'm very reformed. I was like, well, God, everything God does is for a purpose. So I have to like find that purpose. And I realized like, you know, what is the meaning, purpose of anything that happens in life? So that I could glorify God and enjoy God forever, right?
That catechism.
It'll get you. But it was good. It was in that moment because I was like, it's not for me to get rid of. Like, this is my attraction towards women. There's actually something here that can glorify God in it, right? That I could enjoy and learn more about God in a new way, as opposed to seeing it as like something destructive, right? So that was I was like, oh, the whole world is telling me this is going to destroy things, but God is going to make things beautiful. And I started to embrace that. And so at the time from 2010 or 2011 until like 2015, 2016, I was like deeply invested in like a side B position. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to be celibate, or I'm going to marry a man, or like no man is going to want me because he's going to think I'm broken. But I'm in. Like I said, when I was 13, I was like, could I be single? And I was like, I think I can. And you know, at that point when I was like, I'm coming out and I'm realizing this is part of myself, I was like, God called my bluff. I was like, you said you would accept celibacy and singleness if that was an option, and now you might actually be faced with that. And suddenly I had so much more compassion for gay people. But I really wanted to figure out what it meant to be queer, and that was the first word I started using to identify myself in that situation, because I started reading a lot of queer theory, critical race theory, feminist theory, and I realized like queerness isn't just about who you have sex with. It's really about an entire mindset, a framework to think about oppression and liberation, and the way we've constructed our world in terms of gender and sexuality. And saying that having a radical vision towards a new way of seeing gender and sexuality and economy and hegemony and all these other things. And so that was really good for me. I felt like I could be a member of the queer community, even if I was celibate, no matter who I was having sex with. And I think that's a gift that I've received as a person who was deeply invested into the side B community for a long time. And it's something that I carry with me today, that I think that as a bisexual person, as a queer person, I'm like, I could marry a man, I could marry a woman, I could be single, whatever, but I'm queer, bitches.
Good.
So I don't know how much time do I have left? Is it time to?
2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I pursued a lot of like spiritual friendships, committed platonic relationships. And I dug into my community, which was actually quite receptive. I ended up coming out to them, it was at the women's retreat, so that's everybody to me. And because I was like, everyone's just gonna go home and tell their husbands. So I basically came out to the whole church. That was in early 2015, and they received it really well, and they supported my vision and my commitment. And that kind of changed after my convictions, my theological convictions around sex and marriage and how God ordains those things started to shift. And that led to me asking bigger questions about how is romantic attraction different from sexual attraction, in friendship in particular. I think that when I was side B, I was very scared of temptation. And for me, I realized that oftentimes the thing to do when you feel afraid is actually to lean in, right? So I was like, okay, I don't want to hug my friends that are women. I don't want to have physical interaction with them, but I actually need to have healthy engagements with that, as opposed to pulling away completely. Though I wasn't able at that time to separate romantic and sexual attraction. And it wasn't until I had a more side A-ish kind of perspective that I was able to separate romantic attraction from sexual attraction, because I fell in love with a straight girl. And then, no, but I mean, like, it was good though, because it was the first time I let myself feel romantic things towards another woman, because I didn't feel dangerous and off limits. And I was able to like have a full romantic expression of friendship with her, even though we never kiss, we don't like, we don't have sex, and nothing of a sexual, physical nature. So around that time also, I started to get really involved in queer Twitter. And thank God for Twitter. And is Elio Cruz in the room?
He's not.
He said he was gonna come. Okay, and live tweet the whole thing. But I started following Elio, and I have no idea how that happened. But he always has been so big in advocating for the use of the word bisexual. And specifically, it was kind of calling out bisexual people for identifying as queer and not as bisexual. And it was the first time I really saw somebody who was a person of color, who was a Christian, who's also, queer bisexual, talking about that, and I deeply resonated with it. So that's around the time I started to use the term bisexual more openly. Internally, I was always like, well, if I have to fill out a form, I guess I'm bisexual. But I always told people I was queer because I wanted the opportunity for people to ask me, what does that mean? What does that mean? Usually that's people's response. And then I get the privilege of being able to explain what it means to me, right? As opposed to like whatever people think it means. So where am I today? Who I date, I will tell you that my apps are set only to women. And that's not because I'm not capable of attraction to men. It's just that I'm not a fan of being harassed. So that's just kind of where I am. I'm always like, it's possible. God could make a beautiful, godly man for me. I'm just not going to count on that happening. And this is what I tell people a lot, is that I just apply the same standards I have for women to men, and there's just not a lot of men that reach those standards. So anyway, I'm open to it, right? I'm open to it. But whether or not I end up with a man or a woman, or if I'm single, I'm always queer. And I think for me, that's the really important part, is that I was able, in my side B experience, I was able to detach performance of an identity from the essence of identity that's within me, whether or not I ever act or perform. We are always going to lose if we're playing games of, are you gay enough? Are you queer enough?
Yep.
Are you Asian enough? Whatever it is. It's like, for me, I come from a community that is like, you are who you are in God, and nothing you can take that away, right? Like, you're never beyond, right? And I don't need to perform whatever identities or I have or aspire to have in order to be seen as valuable or worthy. And in some ways, within the queer community, we police our own people with the reverse. Like it's the reverse of homophobia. It's like in our larger society, queer people are shamed, right, and degraded for expressing gayness, right? But oftentimes in the like gay community, we're denigrated for expressing what people would assume as heterosexuality. And I think that whether or not if I do end up with a man, I am fully confident that my relationship could be queer, right? Because queerness isn't about body parts. It's not about the kind of physical sex we have. It's actually about a vision and a hope that we have to transform and to be a part of a church and a community, right? That is not just about a nuclear relationship that's navel-gazy. It's about how we, as a unit, can greater serve the church, right? And I think that whatever marriage you have, whether people in it are all straight or if it's queer, that should be, that's the role that these relationships, these sexual relationships ultimately need to serve, is to glorify God, right?
Which is
sort of the perfect transition. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to talk about a lot of that last piece. Yeah, and the reason we have to like police ourselves on time so much is because like SueAnn and I can literally talk forever. Like the last time we were on the phone, it was for like 2 hours. Because nobody else will talk shop with me. I gotta like dust off that theology degree. But my name is Emily Joy. I identify as bisexual. It's easy to know that because of my hair. And also my bisexual wolf t-shirt, which I just wanted to make sure everybody saw. The mountain is also a wolf. It's very exciting. Yeah, it's super meta. I just wanted to share my story a little bit. So as SueAnn mentioned, I was homeschooled. I was the oldest of 7 children.
Was?
Well, I am. Although I don't have a deep connection to most of my family now. So a lot of times when I do speak to them, it is more in like past tense verbs sometimes. But not related to issues of sexuality. But I am the oldest of 7 children. I have a degree in theology and philosophy from One Moody Bible Institute. I did not come out until a year into my marriage to a cisgender heterosexual man, which puts me in what they are calling these days a mixed orientation marriage. But not on purpose. It just kind of happened. We hear a lot of coming out stories, especially at GCN, and a lot of people have these stories about how, it was just this thing that I always knew from when I was young. I knew that I was also attracted to women, and I was like, y'all, like, I was genuinely surprised by myself. And this happens to me always, and there's a lot of reasons for this. I think, number one, is anybody in here familiar with the Enneagram? Yes, okay, so on the Enneagram, I'm like a pretty hard 5. And so for me, you're laughing. For me, like I can talk circles around myself in my head, but there's no real use to like these mental exercises for me until I have actual physical data to work with, right? And so part of it is like I wasn't sexually active until maybe like 6 or 9 months really before I got married, and so there was sort of, I didn't have any data to work with, really, and like once I got the data, this sounds so robotic, but like once I got the data, I was like, oh, duh, I'm also attracted to women, right? Like this, but it was just, and so there's the personality aspect of it, but there's also, I think, just the binary presented by purity culture doesn't really leave bisexuality as an option, especially because purity culture generally doesn't deal with non-straight orientations, and when it does, it's basically just to denigrate gay and lesbian orientations, and occasionally transgender identity, but not, bisexuality doesn't really occur to them that is like a thing, right? Which is where, I think that we look at somebody like Rosaria Butterfield, who I would, people are allowed to identify however they want, obviously, but I think, you look up the word bisexual in the dictionary, and this is, somebody that experiences attraction to genders that are like yours and also like yours, not necessarily in the same time, way, and amount, the famous definition for it. But, so I think a lot of misunderstanding, I guess what I'm saying, around like ex-gay conversion therapies comes from bierasure, in that sense, because we're not presenting that as an option. People are like, well, you're gay, or lesbian, or you're straight. And misunderstanding that bisexuality is a huge middle identity, I think, leads to a lot of that. So
I will say one thing about Rosaria, because I heard her speak at a church in Nashville a couple years ago, and she will tell them, well, she used to tell them, I don't know if she tells them anymore, that she never felt like her attraction to women was is an exclusive thing, and that but a lesbian was more like a political term for her.
Totally.
So, but of course, the Christian book publishers, they wanted a lesbian turned straight, right? But
makes a better story.
it's interesting because when you talk to her, actually, she doesn't say that her sexuality changed.
Yeah. Even though everybody who wants to believe that sexuality can change wants to use people like her as a
example.
A poster child. Yeah. Also, Christopher Yuan, who I'm familiar with because he was obviously a professor at Moody. But yeah, so that's kind of my story. And when I came out to myself, I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. Like, I don't know how I could have known it prior to that exact time. But once I accepted it, I was like, oh, that makes like certain friendships that I had make sense. And you kind of go back and start filling in the pieces, and you're like, okay, I see this. And so then I went home and told my husband like an hour later, and he was like really supportive of it. Actually, he's very excellent. When you first come out and you're married, you like just start Googling everything, or like I do, right? Trying to like make sense of what's happening in my experience. And people have a lot of like really terrible stories of ways that their partners have taken this news, and mine is really lovely. He's great. So.
I can confirm.
Yeah. Hashtag Twitterless Billy is my hashtag for him because he doesn't have Twitter. But sometimes.
And as much as Emily uses Twitter, Billy does not.
Yeah. He's not on any social media. He's like Ron Swanson. Delete all pictures of Ron. But yes, so that was one thing I wanted to say. So it's interesting, going back to what SueAnn was saying at the end of her time there, because first of all, there's a lot of bierasure being a bi woman married to a straight man, because people just automatically assume that you're straight. As there is when you are a bi person in a relationship with someone of your same gender, people just assume that you're gay or lesbian, right? So this goes both ways, I told you there was going to be bad puns. I warned you multiple times. But so what that looks like in terms of how I exist as a healthy queer person in a relationship with a cisgender heterosexual man that causes people to erase my sexual identity whenever we're together. And it's interesting because when we're together, people obviously think that we're straight, but I never get clocked as straight when I'm alone.
Well, not anymore.
No.
Not anymore.
No, well, because of the haircut. But like on my birthday, me and Billy and my best friend Hannah, we all went out, and our gay bartender was so nice to us because he thought that me and Hannah were together, and Billy was like our straight friend. And then he was like super mean to us when Billy and I asked for our checks together. And I was like, let me get this straight. You only liked me when you thought I was with Hannah?
Let me get this straight.
Let me get this clear. But there's this idea, as SueAnn was saying, of having to like perform queerness, right? And we basically, when we're talking about that, we're talking about sex acts, right? Like you're only queer if you are having this particular kind of sex that we deem as queer enough. And a lot of times, what I find heavily problematic about this is that it comes down to genitalia. So people are saying, like, you're only queer if it's two of the same kind of genitalia interacting in this situation. And I'm like, it's deeply biphobic, but it's also heavily transphobic. Like, there's so many deep problems with that. But I think that that's what we're talking about, right? When we're talking about performing this sense of queerness. And so I've had to figure out what does it look like for me to exist as a whole, healthy, like fully myself queer person in this relationship. And so some of that looks like, especially when we're talking about queer identity building outside of sex acts, is just like showing up in queer spaces. Like this conference was an important pilgrimage for me to make. And Billy will come and like march in Pride with me and stuff, but I go to a lot of queer spaces on my own. I go to Queer Dance Party and all these things. And he's done a really good job of like allowing me like the space to like expand as much as I need to, which I think is really great. But yeah, there's so much queer identity building and queer identity formation that exists outside of like what body parts are interacting with what other body parts when we go on dates, and that's kind of getting into like the academic definition of queer, of like doing things beyond the normative and all that kind of stuff, and we don't really have to like get into the academic stuff. But I think I sometimes do use queer and bisexual interchangeably, because for me, I think especially in the beginning when I was struggling with a lot of internalized biphobia of like not being bi enough because I'm married to a man and I had only ever dated men before, I felt like queer was a little bit easier to take on for me. like, because it was a little bit more of like an umbrella, so to speak. So now I'm getting more comfortable with using bisexual. But that's really been a journey for me as well over the last, I mean, I've only been out for like a year and a half, 2 years. So my clock on my wrist of how long I've been, just like my wrist clock, making little tally marks. But yeah, so that's been a really interesting journey, and it's so funny. It's freaking hilarious that I'm here doing this right now, because when I first came out, like anybody who follows me on the internet knows that like I talk about a lot of like really personal things on the internet. And when I first came out, I was like, I am not going to talk about this on the internet. I am not going to make a big deal about this or like make it part of my platform or whatever. And then last week I was like screaming at this lady on Twitter, like, I can't stop being bisexual to make you more comfortable, Janet.
Okay, wait. I thought of this story earlier to this day. I can't remember if it's you, but someone called you and you and Hannah maybe allies one time, and I was like, ally to myself.
Yeah. Also, when all the Church 2 stuff was happening, this pastor guy called us a lesbian and a yoga teacher.
Yes!
I was like,
for the record, they are bisexual.
We're both bisexual. I do teach yoga, but like, you were only half right.
Two bis make a lesbian? I don't know.
I know that's what it is. I think maybe. That's the math, right?
Gay math.
But yeah. So yeah.
You're coming out.
Yeah, so I came out, and then now I just talk about it on the internet, and here I am at Gay Christian Network at my first year here giving a presentation and stuff. So, yeah, but I think a lot of that at the beginning was internalized biphobia of stuff too, because I think I was afraid if I talked about it on the internet that people would think that I was a fraud. And frankly, I don't feel like that fear is totally unjustified, because there is some of that, and I will say I have some really lovely gay and lesbian friends who have been extremely supportive of me. I think sometimes we kind of shit on the gay and lesbian community a little bit of like, oh, they're so, and I'm like, okay, but most of the gay and lesbian people that I know have been unbelievably supportive of me. But there are those people who are out there doing the queer policing a little bit. And so yeah, that's also been a journey of like learning how to like speak about this in public and like remember that my queer identity is a project of mine that other people
in progress.
Yeah, it's a project in progress that other people don't get to tell me that I'm not queer enough or bi enough, or so it is. Yeah, that's me being vulnerable. I'm gonna go back into my turtle shell after this. But yeah, and so I guess on that I've got a couple more minutes and then we'll take some questions. But I think a lot of the kind of ire and discussion that we have around these issues of queer enough and sex acts versus queer community building and like all these things come down to seeing queer identity as a very like individualistic thing rather than a collective community, right? Because, and it's true, we're all individuals and we have our own stories and our own experiences, but also like queer is a community and a culture also, and so seeing it as a collective family, dysfunctional as it may be, that we can enter into, as opposed to just, I have sex with a woman and so therefore I am a lesbian or whatever, or so therefore I am bi enough or whatever it is, right? Seeing it as a collective community that we can enter into, I think is really important to figuring out our place in the world, especially for those of us who don't necessarily fit traditional stories of coming out or of how we identify.
You threw me off, but
Queer identity, collectivism.
Yes. So
this is why we work
when
well together.
I started identifying as queer, I think there was a shift in my life because when I first started coming out, I wanted to distance myself from lesbian, gay, and bisexual people because that was what I needed. I felt like I needed to do to survive in the Christian world. And so when I started to identify as queer, it was a significant shift because I realized that I was a part of them, whether I wanted to be or not. And I think for bi people, that's a really important thing to talk about because sometimes they're like, you're passing, blah, 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 all these sorts of things. When it comes down to it, like, who are your people, right?
Yeah.
Taking on an identity means taking on its joys and its sorrows. And so that's the thing about passing is that it's
it's wanting to consume an identity and only taking the parts of it that give you joy, not the parts that commune with sorrow.
Yeah.
And as my journey continued, I realized I had way more in common with the LGBTQ community than I did with all the straight Christians that I thought were my people. Because in the end, that's kind of, I was hopeful, but in the end, that's kind of what ended up happening.
Yeah. Well, and ultimately, that is why I decided to come out, is what she just said was I felt like I came out in May of 2016, and I didn't really start talking about it like anywhere until that fall. So about 6 months, I just kind of sat on it and talked to like my husband and my best friend. And ultimately, one of the reasons that I decided to come out was because I felt like I didn't want to be a passive consumer of my identity, but I wanted to enter into the sorrows and the suffering of the community as well and be a full participant in it. And there are some things that I don't have to worry about, like being yelled at when I'm walking down the street holding hands with my spouse. But there are, I mean, I got harassed at a queer dance party event, and you know, like there's other ways that like that identity has brought me into some of the suffering of the community, and so I think that's ultimately why what pushed me over the edge to come out was feeling like I didn't want to be a passive, you know, kind of sideline observer of what was happening, but to enter fully into it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I like looked back at my notes and I realized there's something I wanted to say and
Oh,
I
yeah.
forgot. Which was when I was coming out and I was side B, people assumed that I was monosexual and that I was like completely gay. And I think it's because very few bisexual people come out with like a side B perspective, because it's like, well, then why are you even coming out? You'll just marry a man. I felt very confident that like my queerness would probably actually disqualify me from being a desirable candidate for a good reformed wife with a nice reformed boy. But that was really interesting. I would come out to people. After a couple years after I'd come out, I'd often have conversations, and people all thought I was a lesbian. And I started at a certain point also consciously pushing back at that, and I thought that was important. But also when I would come out to people, they'd be like, "Well, I know like gay people who've like gotten married to like people of the opposite sex," and I would be like, "You know what? My hope is not put in a man, it's actually put in God." Woo! And like, I believe that God can give me a fulfilling life, single, celibate, or with a man, but I'm not gonna put my hope in marrying a man. And I think that if I had been more sure of my own bisexuality at that time, if I'd been more confident in it, I could have pushed back at a lot of kind of the ex-gay-ish kind of messages I got from my community. No one ever was like, maybe you can change your sexuality, but I never felt like I needed to, because I was like, I don't need to like produce attraction to men. It's there, even though they make it really hard.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. If anybody has any questions, we can talk about those. Yes. And we have to repeat it so they can get on the recording.
This is a question that was actually brought up in one of the previous workshops.
Okay.
But it's a really good one, I think, for this.
Yes.
I'm super side A. Is there anything that we can do to help support the side B bisexual people that may not eventually transition to side A and will stay side B?
Yeah.
I have an answer.
This is a SueAnn question because I'm also super side A. There you go.
Yes, I have several side B friends who are bisexual. One of them is divorced, and the other one is married and to a straight. So one is a boy, one is a girl. She is married to a man. He is divorced from his ex-wife. And that was the reason why she left him, as he told her. And I think that happens a lot. And I wish we would just talk about bisexual people in existence, and we would ultimately really just let ex-gay terminology die. I think that those things are hand in hand, right? We can't like keep being like, well, then he's healed or he's changed or it's fine, because like your sexuality doesn't disappear just because you end up with a partner or you marry somebody. And one of my friend who's the woman who's married to a man, she's been married to him for 6 years and she just came out to him. They have 3 children together.
And thankfully he received it very well, and he was like, I feel like I know you better now, and I can love you better. But it was something that she never felt like it was worth telling him because she was never gonna act on it. There was an ache in her, there was something that she felt like she lost. And I think that speaks the biggest for bisexuality as an orientation, as opposed to just like, well, you are whatever you have sex with. Because there was a part of her that was lost because she couldn't be honest about that. And it kind of goes back to, you know, my like very zealous, you know, 19-year-old self being like, the sin is not the sex, the sin is the lying, right? And I am forced to hide because of the environment that we're in. So I think first of all, side B communities need to stop. Like, we really need to differentiate between side B people and side X. And I think that's the first kind of differentiation we need to make. I think that side A people are actually really guilty of this. They conflate side B people with side X people, and that only is going to make it harder for everyone in the end. So that's like the first step. I think in our conversation, we have to change the way we have conversations too. And talking about bisexual people, not disparaging people who stay in marriages like that. The guy I know who was, his wife left him. I told him, like, I was like, if you want to be with a guy or a girl, like, I think for him, I need to tell him that even if he ends up with a woman, I don't think that he's like less queer. I think that's what he actually has to hear in our relationship, because he's not out, right? And I'm so out that everyone comes to me who's all the bi people who are like who are passing, they actually come and find me.
Oh God. That also, I just want to say too, I mean, I know there's not like a lot of straight people here, but like literally every time I talk about this on the internet, I've got, my inbox is like 3 or 4 women who are married to men reaching out to me being like, oh my God, this is my story too. Like, I don't know what to do, but like, and I'm like, there's so many of us. Like, there's so many of us. It's ridiculous. Michael.
Hi.
Hi.
So related to that, do you have any advice for people that are in a relationship and a mixed orientation relationship and then going through a change? You know, you've been together for a long time.
How one's for you?
How did you navigate that discussion?
Yeah.
And what did it actually look like in reality for him?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I probably did not handle several of the discussions that we had over it as good as I could have. That's a thing that that I've come to terms with, is there was probably some discussions. So the very first conversation we had about it was great, because it was like fresh. I just like came home and I was like, by the way. But I came home and I was like, by the way, this is the case. Here is a fact about me that I just recently discovered, and now you can know it also. So that was a pretty chill conversation. It was also like midnight, and he was like already asleep, but I like couldn't wait till the morning. I'm terrible to live with, truly. But yeah, so that initial conversation was really good. We had subsequent conversations that were really difficult, and I think some of it was because I probably did not approach the conversation with as much grace and care for his feelings as I should have. Some of those conversations, I was a bit a bull in a china shop, I think. And so as in a lot of things that I have done in my life, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that other people do it the same. But I mean, one thing I would deeply recommend is therapy. We went to therapy. I went to my own individual therapy, and worked on a lot of like communication issues that made like every part of our relationship better. So like, yay therapy. And I know that therapy is not accessible to a lot of people. I had to find a sliding scale place too, so I feel that. But if you can go to therapy, do. That was a very important thing, I think, in giving us the communication tools to discuss very difficult, nuanced conversations like that, and other things. Like, it really did help all of our relationship. So I would say that, and to just stay in conversation about it, you know, especially with bisexuality. I come out like all the time. Like, you come out to like every new person you meet, right? So it's just literally like perpetual coming out forever and ever until you die. The end. No, but it is perpetual conversation. I think, it's definitely not a thing where you just have the conversation once and then that's it. You good? You came out and you just go back to life as normal. That is not what happens.
Well, I also think that people assume if you identify as queer that you must be monosexual. I think we need to start asking more questions, and not just assuming. Because, when I started getting more involved with the queer Christian world and I was coming out, everyone assumed, and they would make jokes and things about men and whatever. I'm like, I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
But
I think arming ourselves with the education about that, I think also made it the more that I read and learned, the more I was better able to express myself to him, and then the more that he learned and the better our communication got about it. So yeah, just having it be a thing where you stay in conversation, and we have. Now it's just a given, right? Now it's just part of our lives. But at first it did require some sustained, intentional conversation. So if anybody else is in that position and wants to talk to me afterwards, I would absolutely want to do that, and I'm going to get wine after this, so we could maybe involve that with it. Yes?
Do you have any advice on how to help people understand that bisexuality is valid? Because I have my parents say, you haven't always liked girls, so let's just be your thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll let SueAnn answer this one, but one thing I will say is that I experience my bisexuality different week to week. Day to day. I don't know if anybody else, but sometimes sometimes I'm like Channing Tatum, and sometimes I'm like Mila Kunis, and that movie about Jupiter Rising really confused me. but you know what I'm saying? It's very up and down for me, week by week, day by day. So I think one thing is making it clear that over time it vacillates, and that's normal and okay.
I also think you're a queer baby right now.
I am.
It's kind of evened out for me a little bit. But I did want to, so your question is about how do we push back against this whole but you used to girls, blah, blah, blah. I think we need to stop thinking of attraction on a binary scale, in the sense that the more I'm attracted to one gender means the less I'm attracted to other genders.
It's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, it's not a zero-sum game. These things overlap. They're not mutually exclusive. Yeah. And I the Kinsey scale helps me sometimes to describe my general, I'm generally more attracted to women than men, but I explained, it's more that they gotta get their shit together. And but I think that this idea that one is not the other, that's actually the root of a lot of the issues that we continue to face in the queer Christian community. This assumption that attraction to one inherently means a disattraction to the other. I also thought of another point to the first question, which I said, first we have to support bisexual people who are in side B community, but I think that the way we do that is by believing side B monosexual people when they say, I am not repressed, and I am not less queer by not having sex. So I think that's kind of the foundation, because that's where the majority of the conversation kind of lives a lot of the time. And also, you can't shame anyone into embracing an identity. That doesn't work. So the first step is when, if you, let's say you have disagreements with somebody who is side B and you're side A, and they say, I am queer, but I choose not to act on it. Your response should not be I'm gonna tell you how to be queer, you're self-hating, whatever. It's literally every single person has to go through a journey of figuring out their own sexuality, how to reconcile that with God and with their community. And I think if we can start there, that's also the way. If it's is your question specifically about your parents? Or just yeah. I also want to open up, because I know there's a lot of bi people in the room, if you have your own advice for this, because it's not just about me and Emily. We're a community, and we're going to share experiences. Yeah.
I have a metaphor.
Okay, great.
Lovely.
Share your metaphor.
Being bi is like a futon.
Being bi is like a futon.
Sometimes it's in a couch form.
Sometimes it's in a couch form.
Sometimes it's in a bed form.
Sometimes it's in a bed form.
Either way, it's a futon.
Either way, it's a futon.
Perfect.
This sounds suspiciously like metaphors for the Trinity. I feel like there's an egg thing about to happen, or water and ice. What's happening?
Oh, but I was going to say that this false binary of one equals less of the other is actually how I often experience people's perception of my my identity ethnically. So the more Asian I am, the less American I am. The more American I am, the less Asian I am. Actually, those two things are not at odds with each other. And that I've always known inside of me, even though the world has always tried to tell me something different. So I think that oftentimes, by kind of like pulling out these logical fallacies, one other thing I love is like people are like, is light is it a wave or is it a particle? And you're like, it's kind of both.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of the mystery, that God created the earth.
Yes, in the glasses. Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Can you tell us more about the queer vision for life that is accessible to both bi people, side B people, side A people, the thing that sort of unites us all? You mentioned a little bit about that.
Right.
Queer
about
vision
no matter
for life.
Yeah, I was saying if no matter who I end up marrying or having sex or not having sex with. So I think that my queer vision walks hand in hand with my vision of the church as family, right? We have this very new idea that family is like a man, a woman, and 2 children. That idea like pretty much started in the 50s. Before that, we have like huge clans. We have multiple generations, people together. In Chinese culture, I call anybody who's my mom's age auntie, anybody who's my dad's age uncle, right? Like there's ways that these boundaries that we've created, we've idolized. 1, we've created them. 2, we've idolized them. And 3, they're killing us, right? They're killing us because no one person or no like 2 or 3 people are ever supposed to be everything to you, right? And as a body, we have many parts. We all need each other. We need to be in community with one another. And we have to de-exclusivize intimacy, right, from specific relationships. Or like, oh, well, you should only talk to your husband about that, or that's not something that's like only reserved for those kind of relationships. Well, guess what? You're all my brothers and sisters and siblings in Christ, right?
Can I say a thing about that? I have so many good feelings about that because I think that's one thing that coming out while being married in a relationship that from the outside can look very traditional has taught me. And also not having a great relationship with my family as well is that like queer culture is kind of like a choose your own family adventure sort of thing. And like, but my queer like family is the most important thing to me. You know what I'm saying? And I think coming out while being married in a relationship that from the outside looks very traditional really helped me to start critiquing this this very American dream ideal of this one person who will be everything to you, who will be your lover and your best friend, and you will get all of your emotional and sexual needs met from this person, and they will be everything. And then we wonder like why
marriages fail?
Why 60% of marriages end in divorce and those that don't are fraught with infidelity. It's because we have unrealistic expectations for our partners. And so I think, that's also been a huge learning curve for me, but coming out in that context made me realize like, oh, you don't actually have to be everything to me, and I don't have to actually be everything to you, and really gave me like a new perspective on that.
That's liberating.
It's so liberating. It was really great when I realized that we have a much better relationship now. 2 minutes.
Sorry, I'm gonna add the queer vision thing.
Yeah.
So if you study a lot of queer theory, you'll realize that this construction of the idea of the nuclear family, it doesn't just exist to exist. It's actually a tool used to oppress. And so it's definitely a part of capitalism. It's about the way the government controls us. I sound like a conspiracy theorist right now, but a queer conspiracy.
You're like that meme.
I have a lot of queer conspiracies, but I definitely
I believe in aliens.
That's a queer conspiracy. That's another topic. But the nuclear family, it exists, it actually is a tool of capitalism to deprive us of each other so that we spend more money thinking that things and consumption can fill the hole that actually community is actually to be a part of. And so what that looks like tangibly in many ways could be like intergenerational homes. Like you think to yourself, the classic is you get married, you buy a house, and then the 2 of you live in that big old house alone. And I think a lot of like cohabitation, these sorts of things, these like collective communes, whatever, literally like I could have a vision for a queer community, which includes side A, side B, bisexual people. One of my really good friends and I were literally talking about this last night. We could all be together, support one another, right?
Yeah.
So,
Can we take the one more question over here, and then, yeah, we'll be good after
and
that.
you can always come and talk
Oh,
to
yeah,
us at the end.
we're going to hang afterwards.
Sorry I've already answered is I think what do you say to someone in the church who's straight who says, why don't you just marry the opposite sex and be done with it? Like,
I mean, I'd
God
be like
works
I did.
in mysterious ways.
I'd be like I did, and I'm still having...
Don't hold the mic like that.
Oh, thank you. SueAnn is like an audio-visual person, and I am a poet, and that is why I'm holding it like this. But no, I'd be like I did, and I still felt like something was missing. You know, I still felt like I wasn't being true to myself. Yeah.
The man plants his steps, but God makes the way. So I'm just saying, like, oftentimes when people, they're very locked into the specific idea of what goodness, righteousness, fruitfulness could look like. And I always say, like, God, like I'm prepared for whatever God is going to bring to me.
Okay, come on.
And I think that's like the easiest for people, the kind of people who would be like, why don't you just marry a woman? You're like, why don't you value singleness? That's kind of my like default. It's like people think I'm only going to be fulfilled if I end up married. Oof. And I think that for people who especially come from more conservative places, who are generally the people who are like, well, why don't you just marry someone? Why don't you just have a hetero passing relationship? I'm like, but then I would lose out on like everything. Every single choice you make is an opportunity cost, right? And for me, like personally, I don't know who I'm gonna end up with, but what I do know is that I want to see God, and if I'm so obsessed with my own idea of what fruitfulness and righteousness looks like, I often miss out on the amazing things that God is laying before me. So that was always my kind of knee-jerk reaction when people would say things like that when I came out. But I also think that it's not a conversation. That's not a conversation ender. That's kind of more of a conversation starter, as to ask people why they idolize heterosexual marriage and why they think that you should act this way, and well, why not other things?
You don't even have to go to church tomorrow now. You got it here. Okay, so that's our time. Would love to talk about more things.